G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 28 of the book of Jeremiah. We're looking at chapter 43, verse 1 to chapter 44, verse 23 today. Thus far, what's happened? Well, so far we've had Gedaliah was appointed the governor of the land of Judah, and his capital was Mizpah, but we see that Gedaliah was killed by some other Jews. And now, not only did they kill Gedaliah, but they also murdered the entire garrison of Babylonian soldiers there. So now they're a bit worried that Nebuchadnezzar, when he finds out, will come and destroy them. So they're going to head off into Egypt. They come to ask Jeremiah, what does God say about them heading off into Egypt? Not that they intended to obey what God said, because they already planned to go to Egypt. When Jeremiah says, you must stay in the land, God says to stay in the land, and God will be merciful to you, and God will protect you in the land. They said, no, we're going to go to Egypt. And so they disobeyed God, and they're going to head off down into Egypt, and where we are today. And Egypt, they're going to head off down there to try and escape from the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar. But in actual fact, if they go down into Egypt, God says through Jeremiah, it's exactly what's going to happen to you if you go to Egypt. So now we see the people's rejection of the message, which was Jeremiah's message to their request, in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 43. And it came to pass that when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking unto all the people all the words of Jehovah their God, wherewith Jehovah their God had sent him to them, even all these words, then spake Azariah the son of Hoshiah, and Johanan the son of Kareah, and all the proud men, saying unto Jeremiah, you speak falsely. Jehovah our God has not sent you to say, you shall not go into Egypt to sojourn there, but Baruch the son of Neriah sets you on against us. Deliver us into the hand of the Chaldeans, that they may put us to death and carry us away captive to Babylon. So what we see here is in verses 1 to 7, this documents the rejection of Jehovah's command to remain in Judah. Instead, the people now followed their original plan to move to Egypt in the hopes of escaping Nebuchadnezzar's vengeance against Judah for the assassination of Gedaliah and the Babylonian garrison stationed at Mizpah. In verses 1 to 3, we see the rejection itself. In verse 1, the timing of the rejection was when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking. All that Jeremiah said from back in chapter 42, 7 to 13, the people now rejected. And when he finished, there was the initial and immediate rejection of his message. The people did not even bother to deliberate over their response. They already made up their mind. In verse 2, the ones responsible for this rejection were Azariah the son of Hoshiah, Johanan the son of Kareah, and all the proud captains. So those in leadership positions led the rest astray. And their claim in verses 2 to 3 was, first of all, in verse 2, that Jeremiah is speaking falsely. They believed that, they said, and they believed that Jehovah did not send Jeremiah to speak these words, and neither did Jehovah forbid them to go to Egypt to sojourn there. And so they actually accused Jeremiah of being a liar. Now remember, Jeremiah prophesied that Babylon would come and destroy Judah and Jerusalem, and he did. So I'm not sure why they now decide, well, you're a liar, you're not telling the truth, you're not from God at all. And then second, in verse 3, they accused Jeremiah's secretary, Baruch the son of Neriah, of turning Jeremiah against the people. Now, Baruch, they said, did this, they believed, as part of his own private conspiracy. His purpose, they thought, was to deliver the remnant of the people into the hands of the Chaldeans to put them to death, or that they might put them in Babylonian captivity. And then in verse 3, after seeing Jeremiah's other prophecies fulfilled to the letter, they were not willing to accuse Jeremiah directly of conspiracy. Therefore, what did they do? Blamed it upon his servant, or his scribe, Baruch. And then in verses 4 to 7, we see the journey down into Egypt. In verse 4, we have the active disobedience. So Johanan the son of Kareah and all the captains of the forces and all the people obeyed not the voice of Jehovah to dwell in the land of Judah. So they obeyed not the voice of Jehovah. And this included the leader, Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the other captains of the forces and all the people as well. The people did not, kick up a stink against the leadership in opposing Jeremiah. They joined in. So this made them equally as guilty and deserving of punishment as their leaders. They all disobeyed the command to dwell in the land of Judah and not to go into the land of Egypt, every one of them. And verse 5 now reiterates who the leaders of Judah were. But Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces took all the remnant of Judah that were returned from all the nations whither they had been driven to now sojourn in the land of Judah. In verse 5, we're told concerning the remnant, Johanan, the son of Kareah, took the people, take him down to the land of Egypt. This included all the captains of the forces, all the sub-commanders. So what we see here is that Johanan was obviously the one in the lead role. He's the leader. Now, the remnant of Judah, but only recently, in less than 2 months, had returned from Ammon. Remember Ammon across the other side of the Jordan? It returned from Ammon after they'd heard that Gedaliah had been appointed governor of the land. That's back in Jeremiah 40. Jeremiah 40 verses 11 to 12. Now, after a very short stay in their homes, 2 months in the land of Judah, not even 3 months later, these returnees were willing to leave the country again and head down towards Egypt. And then in verse 6, we see the men and the women and the children and the king's daughters and every person that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had left with Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch, the son of Neriah. So those that were left by Nebuzaradan, who was the general under Nebuchadnezzar, these are the people he left under Gedaliah's care. They all now going to flee to Egypt. So we have the 4 categories of people included here, which were the men, the women, the children, and the king's daughters. So these are the ones who were taken into Egypt, and they went away very willingly. Now, at the same time, so these guys are happy to go down there, are willing to go down there, but we also have at the same time, we have 2 others were taken quite unwillingly in verse 6, and that is Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch the son of Neriah were also taken into Egypt, but it was against their will, because they knew that these events were in disobedience to God's command, because Jeremiah told them what to do. They said, stay in the land. But no, we're going to go down to Egypt, and you're going to come with us. Now, God will hold the others responsible because they're willingly disobeying God. He'll not hold Jeremiah and Baruch responsible. Why? Because they were taken into Egypt by force. They were not taken based on their own free will. And in verse 7, and they came into the land of Egypt, for they obeyed not the voice of Jehovah, and they came on to Tahpanhes. Now in verse 7, we see them arriving in Egypt. And this is actually in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, because Moses, back in Deuteronomy 28:68, predicted that someday they would return to Egypt because of disobedience. And this is what they're doing. And the reason was that they did not obey the voice of Jehovah. This was in violation of Jeremiah 42, verses 7 to 22, and also Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. Now, the place of settlement in Egypt was known as Tahpanhes. It's a bit of a frontier city in the eastern Nile Delta. Also, it's mentioned right back in Jeremiah 2, verse 16. Jeremiah 2:16. Actually, the site today is called Tel Defene, and it's situated on the Suez Canal. So that's where they headed down there to settle. Now, we've left Judah. We're now in Egypt. We're going to look at them in Egypt from chapter 43, verse 8, down to chapter 44, verse 3. We're going to see the prophecy of the Babylonian conquest of Egypt in verses 8 to 13. So, upon arrival in Egypt, Jeremiah began prophesying regarding the fate of the Jewish people in this land. And we're going to look at this section in two parts here. First of all, we're going to look at the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Egypt in verses 8 to 13, and then Jeremiah's last message in verses 1 to 30 of chapter 44. So chapter 43, 8 to 13 is talking about the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest, and then chapter 44, 1 to 30 is Jeremiah's last message. Okay, so verse 8, chapter 43. So the prophecy of the Babylonian conquest. Then came the word of Jehovah unto Jeremiah in Tahpanhes, saying, Take great stones in thy hand, hide them in mortar in the brickwork, which is at the entry of Pharaoh's house in Tahpanhes, in the sight of the men of Judah. So in verses 8 to 13, Jeremiah's prophecy is now the coming of the Babylonian conquest. And in verse 8, the word of God now came to Jeremiah in Egypt. He was still a prophet of God, even though he's in Egypt. But now he's just a prophet in the city of Tahpanhes, in the land of Egypt, where he was forced to settle. In verse 9, Jeremiah was asked to perform once again a symbolic action. He was to take great stones into his hand, and then he was to hide them inside the mortar of the brickwork, which was inside the entryway of Pharaoh's house in Tahpanhes. Now, Tahpanhes here, it was neither the capital of Egypt nor a royal city. So the house mentioned here in this verse was not the royal palace, but it may have been a government building used by Pharaoh during his visits to Tahpanhes. And now this symbolic action was to be performed in the sight of the men of Judah. And then in verses 10 to 13, we have the interpretation of this symbolic action. In verse 10, it says, And say unto them, this is the Jews, say unto them, Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will send and take Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will set his throne upon these stones that I have hid, and he shall spread his royal pavilion over them. So these very stones that Jeremiah has now hid in the mortar, in the brickwork of this building, these very stones someday in the near future will serve as the throne of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, you see here, Nebuchadnezzar is called by God his servant. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was not God's servant in the sense that he was a believer in the God of Israel, but he's called God's servant in the sense that he carried out God's will and God's decree. And the prophecy stated here that a day would come when Nebuchadnezzar would set his throne right over the stones that Jeremiah had hidden. He's going to spread his royal pavilion over them. Also in verse 11, he shall come and shall smite the land of Egypt, such as are for death shall be given to death, and such as are for captivity to captivity, and such as are for the sword to the sword. So what we see here is, for those who are for death, they're going to go into death and die. For those who are for captivity, they're going to go into captivity in Babylon. And then for those who are for the sword, will die by the sword. So the results of the Babylonian attack on Egypt would be death and captivity, the very things that the Jews fled Judah for. Now in verses 12 to 13, there is absolutely no doubt that there's going to be a conquest of Egypt by Nebuchadnezzar, and it would happen exactly as Jeremiah had prophesied or had predicted. Verse 12, And I will kindle a fire in the house of the gods of Egypt, and he shall burn them and carry them away captive, and he shall array himself with the land of Egypt, as a shepherd puts on his garment, and he shall go forth from thence in peace. He shall also break the pillars of Beth-shemesh, that is in the land of Egypt, and the houses of the gods of Egypt shall he burn with fire. So what we see here is that God is going to kindle a fire in the houses of the gods of Egypt. He will burn them, and Nebuchadnezzar will then carry them away captive. The Jewish captives who hope to escape from Nebuchadnezzar will find him in the very city in which they have chosen to settle. And also in verse 12, it says Nebuchadnezzar will array himself with the land of Egypt. The picture here is that Nebuchadnezzar will take the land of Egypt, clothe himself with it, just simply as a shepherd puts on his garments. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to claim the land of Egypt for his own. Egypt will become the private property of the king of Babylon. And having claimed Egypt for himself as his property, he would then depart without having received any resistance from his enemies. Then in verse 13 is the fall of Beth Shemesh. Now, Beth Shemesh is the modern city of Heliopolis in Egypt. It says he shall also break the pillars of Beth Shemesh. Well, the name Beth Shemesh in Hebrew means the house of the sun. Heliopolis in Greek means the city of the sun. Hebrew name for this city is On, O-N, just On, O-N. It's found about 5 miles north of the modern Egyptian capital of Cairo, 5 miles north. In this city of Beth Shemesh, or On, or Heliopolis, whichever one you want to call it, was the temple of Ra. Now, Ra was a chief sun god of the Egyptian pantheon. So the houses of the gods of Egypt are going to be burned with fire by Nebuchadnezzar. So he's going to take over completely. Now, Jeremiah does not record the fulfillment of this prophecy anywhere in his book, but we find it elsewhere. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, says that in the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, which was 581 BC, he fell upon Egypt to overthrow it. It says, Josephus writes that he slew the king that then reigned and set up another. He also took those Jews that were captive and led them to Babylon. Such was the end of the nation of the Hebrews. So this is a direct quote from Josephus. Nebuchadnezzar fell upon Egypt to overthrow it. He threw the king that reigned and set up another, and he took those Jews that were captive there and led them to Babylon. And such was the end of the nation of the Hebrews. Now, another non-biblical evidence for the Babylonian invasion of Egypt is a fragmentary inscription on a clay tablet that is stored in the British Museum. The inscription describes a military conflict between the Babylonian army and Amasis, who was a pharaoh who is also known as Moses II, round about 570 to 526 BC. And it says that this conflict took place in the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, so somewhere around about 568, 567 BC. So what we see here is that the testimony of Josephus and the testimony of other historians of this period are very clear, and that is that Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled to the very letter. That's what this was about. Okay. Now, we see Jeremiah's last message in chapter 44, verses 1 to 30. So, Jeremiah now addressed his last recorded words to the Jewish people who had fled to Egypt for protection purposes. And we're going to look at this section in 3 parts here. First part is verses 1 to 14, which is the warning against idolatry, which we're going to look at shortly. And then the people's rejection in verses of Jeremiah in verses 15 to 19, and then the prophet's last warning in verses 20 to 30. So first up, we have in verses 1 to 14 the warning against idolatry. This shows that despite all that had transpired during the Babylonian siege and destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish refugees from Mitzpah continued to worship idols. After all that happens, they're still worshiping idols. And just as Jeremiah did in his temple sermon back in chapter 7, verses 16 to 20, chapter 7, 16 to 20, Jeremiah will again condemn this behavior, and he warned the people of the severe repercussions of their actions. In verses 1 to 6 of chapter 44, we see the review of the past. In verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews that dwelled in the land of Egypt, that dwelled at Migdol and at Tahpanhes, and at Memphis, and in the country of Pathros, saying. So Jehovah's words were intended for all the Jews who had fled to Egypt and had settled in the following places. Migdol, well, Migdol is a city located near the Red Sea and on the east side of the Nile Delta. It's also mentioned in Exodus 14:2. That's Exodus 14:2, and Numbers 33 verse 7 as well. Numbers 33 verse 7. Now, Tapan has, we just looked at that. That's in Jeremiah 43:7. Memphis. Now, Memphis is located 13 miles south of Cairo. Sometimes this city is called Nof, N-O-P-H, in the Hebrew. So this was the key city of Lower Egypt in the northern part of the land. And then we had the land of Pathros. Pathros was the name of Upper Egypt, the southern part of the land. It literally means the land of the south. That's what Pathros means, the land of the south. It probably refers to a region in Upper Egypt somewhere. Okay, so they're just the areas, rough geography. Now, Jeremiah's message begins in verse 2 with a reminder about the present status of both Judah and Jerusalem. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, you have seen all the evil that I have brought upon Jerusalem and upon all the cities of Judah. And behold, this day they are a desolation, and no man dwells therein. So the refugees here from Mizpah, right, had personally experienced the calamity that the God of Israel had brought upon Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Judah were a desolation. This was the reality that they left behind when they fled to Egypt. And in verse 3, God then spells out the reason for that desolation. He says, because of their wickedness, which they have committed to provoke me to anger, in that they went to burn incense and to serve other gods that they knew not, neither they nor you nor your fathers. So the desolation and destruction came upon Jerusalem and Judah because of the wickedness which they committed to provoke God to anger. The means by which they provoked God to anger was through the worship of other gods, through the worship of idols. They burned incense to these other gods. They served these other gods. So from the past to the present generations, they all worship gods they did not know. Idolatry. And then in verse 4, they are without excuse. Why? Because they received prophetic warning. Howbeit I sent unto you all my servants the prophets, rising up early and sending them, saying, oh, do not this abominable thing that I hate. So God reminds them how often he sent his servants the prophets, rising early and sending them. Remember, previously we said that this phrase shows the intensity and the importance of the messages that the prophets proclaimed, and the desire of God to bring the Jewish people back to faith, rising up early and sending them. The continuous message of the prophets was that Israel should not worship idols and so perform an act that Jehovah detested. And Jeremiah used this phrase a number of times with God referring to himself and to the prophets he sent. And we see them there in Jeremiah 7, verse 13 and 25. Jeremiah 11, verse 7, Jeremiah 25, 3-4, Jeremiah 26, verse 5, Jeremiah 29, 19, 32, 33, 35, 14-15, and 44, verse 4. In all those passages, you see Jeremiah using the term rising up early and sending them. So the message is the message these prophets brought was, do not do this abominable thing which I hate. And in verse 5, they consistently proved to be disobedient to the prophets, but they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear to turn from their wickedness, to burn no incense unto other gods. So they were disobedient in several ways. First of all, they didn't listen, right? They simply did not listen to the prophets. Second, they didn't incline their ear. Third, there was a total failure. They failed in several ways also. First, they failed to turn from their wickedness. And again, we see the word shuv, S-H-U-V, Jeremiah's favorite word. Second, they failed to respond and to turn away from burning incense to other gods. And in verse 6, God then reminds them of the results of their activities. Whereof my wrath and mine anger was poured forth and was kindled in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. And they are wasted and desolate as it is this day. So verses 1 to 6 were a quick review of the past for these Jews down in Egypt. Jeremiah now goes on to spell out the present spiritual state of the Jews in Egypt. The spiritual state of the Jews is given in verses 7 to 10. Despite all that had happened in Judah, the wickedness of these people had not changed. They saw and experienced everything, but not going to change. And it was this spiritual state that had brought about the divine judgment to begin with. Verse 7 states that the people were hurting themselves by their stubbornness. Verse 7 says, therefore now, thus says Jehovah, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, wherefore commit you this great evil against your own souls, to cut off from you man and woman, infant and suckling, out of the midst of Judah, to leave you none remaining. So what we see here is the introductory phrase, therefore now. This shows that Jehovah was drawing a conclusion here of the line of argument he'd presented to them in verses 1 to 6. Meaning that because of the people's past sins, many of the cities of Judah had been destroyed. And since this collapse of Judah was brought about by their idolatry, why would the people want to continue in this same sin now that they're in Egypt suffering the results of their wickedness? Why are you going to continue in idolatry? If they continued in this sin of idolatry, the entire community of Jewish refugees would perish. And this is going to result in the cutting off of man and woman, child and infant. And in the end, they'll have no one to remain. So the picture is one of totality of judgment. Those from the midst of Judah will be cut off. None will be left remaining. In other words, their continuance in the great sin of idolatry is going to bring about a total devastation. And this devastation will smite them within the land of Egypt itself. And then in verse 8, Jeremiah spells out the means of bringing out this great evil. In that you provoke me unto anger with the works of your hands, burning incense unto other gods in the land of Egypt, whither you are gone to sojourn, that you may be cut off, and that you may be a curse and a reproach among all the nations of the earth. So what we see is that they provoked in Egypt, escaping from the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem by the Babylonians, because of their idolatry. In Egypt, they provoked God to evil with the work of their hands. The works of their hands were idolatry. They continued to burn incense unto other gods in the land of Egypt. So what they once did in the land of Judah, they continued to practice in the land of Egypt. Again, he warned them that these very sins would cause them to be cut off. They'll become among the nations two things. First of all, a curse, and second, a reproach. So not only would it lead to the loss of life, but also to ridicule. And their activities in continuing to practice idolatry are suicidal. It is as if their entire aim in continuing this sin in this manner was to totally destroy themselves. And then in verses 9 to 10, he points out their failure to learn from history. According to verse 9, they had forgotten the results of their wickedness committed back in the land of Judah. Have you forgotten the wickedness of your fathers and the wickedness of the kings of Judah, and the wickedness of their wives, and your own wickedness, and the wickedness of your wives which they committed in the land of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? So he enumerates here so that there's no failure to understand the problem. 5 times over, he enumerates those responsible for this wickedness. First of all, the wickedness of their fathers. Second, the wickedness of the kings of Judah. Third, the wickedness of the wives of the kings of Judah. And fourth, their own wickedness. And fifth, the wickedness of their own wives. So these 5 groups have brought about this destruction. Notice also in this verse here that we see that there's a special emphasis upon the wives. Jeremiah has mainly ignored the wives up to this time. In the first 43 chapters, he consistently addressed the men and pointed out their guilt. But now there's a special emphasis upon the wickedness of the wives. And the reasons why he suddenly emphasizes the wives who have largely been ignored up to now will become evident as we continue through this chapter 44. In verse 10, the way they have been, so they remain. They are not humbled even unto this day. Neither have they feared, nor walked in my law, nor in my statutes that I set before you and before your fathers. So what we see here is that they were not humble in the past, and they're not humble today down in Egypt. Neither have they feared nor walked in God's statutes and laws. This is the way that they've continued to practice their lives. The statutes and laws which God set before them and their fathers have been largely ignored. And so we're going to see the judgment upon the Jews of Egypt in verses 11 to 14. So having reviewed the spiritual history of his people, God proclaimed a judgment upon the Jewish refugees from Mizpah. This begins in verse 11 with a declaration. Therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will set my face against you for evil, even to cut off all Judah. Hebrew word for evil, remember, is the term ra, R-A, which means adversity. And the adversity that Jehovah would bring upon the refugees is that he would cut off all Judah. In other words, he would cause all Jewish refugees to perish. And then in verse 12, he describes the judgment itself. And I'll take the remnant of Judah that have set their faces to go into the land of Egypt to sojourn there, and they shall all be consumed. In the land of Egypt shall they fall. They shall be consumed by the sword and by the famine. They shall die. From the least even unto the greatest, by the sword and by the famine. And they shall be an execration and an astonishment and a curse and a reproach. So first of all, we see here that the recipients of the judgment would be the remnant of Judah who have set their faces to go into Egypt. They shall all be confounded. In the land of Egypt they'll fall. The Jews who went into Egypt are the recipients here. Second, he gives the means God will use to consume them. And he mentions 2 things that God will use to do that: the sword and famine. The very things for which they left Judah will now come upon them in Egypt. Third, they shall all die. By sword and by famine, they'll all die from the least to the greatest. And finally, in this verse, the loss of life would be total, with the result that the refugees would become, first of all, an execration, second, an astonishment, and third, a curse and a reproach. Nothing left of them. Then in verse 13, the punishment in Egypt will be very similar to what fell upon Judah. For I will punish them that dwell in the land of Egypt, as I have punished Jerusalem, by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence. That's Jeremiah's triad. God promised to punish them in Egypt as he did those in Jerusalem. And the means will be by the same triad, by sword, famine, pestilence. Now in verse 14, he tells the extent of the judgment. So that none of the remnant of Judah that are gone into the land of Egypt to sojourn there shall escape or be left, to return into the land of Judah, to which they have a desire to return to dwell there. For none shall return, save such as shall escape. So the extent will be so that none of the remnant of Judah who went into Egypt shall escape, or be left, or return to the land of Judah. Again, he's using the term shuv here. They want to return, they shall desire to return, but we see that they won't. To drive the point home, he goes on to say here, for none shall return except those who escape. And again, he uses the term shuv, Now, notice here, it said there's a special, unique promise here to the remnant. God will devastate, desolate, and desolate, but there'll always be a remnant left. And in this case, the emphasis here is that the remnant which remains will be very, very few. None shall return except for a few fugitives who will escape. There'll be a massive destruction of the Jews in the land of Egypt. Yet God promises that nevertheless, there will be a very small remnant that will survive, those who will escape. And in verses 11 to 14, the Jews of Egypt are now under judgment because, first of all, they disobeyed the word of the Lord from Jeremiah. Second, they've continued in the same sins of which they were guilty in the land of Judah, idolatry. So in verses 1 to 14, we see that the Jewish refugees who left Mizpah were under judgment because they disobeyed the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, and they continued to practice the same sins of idolatry in Egypt that they were guilty of in Judah. And so what happened in Judah will now happen to them in Egypt. In verses 15 to 19, we see the people's rejection of Jeremiah's message. In verses 15 to 16 is the rejection of the message. Verse 15 spells out the ones who rejected the message. Then all the men who knew that their wives burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great assembly, even all the people that dwelt in the land of Egypt, in Pathros, answered Jeremiah, saying. So specifically here, all the men who knew that their wives were burning incense to other gods rejected Jeremiah's message. Back in Jeremiah 7, verse 18, back there, we saw that it was the wives who were baking cakes to worship the Queen of Heaven. All the women standing by, a great assembly, also rejected Jeremiah's message. The fact that we see here it was a great assembly shows that this was an official gathering of the Jewish refugees from Mizpah. It included both husbands and wives, and Jeremiah used the occasion of this official gathering to give his final message to the people. This great assembly, which included all the people who lived in the land of Egypt, rejected his message, all the Jews, that is. Specifically, all the Jews who lived in Pathros or Upper Egypt rejected his message. And the subject here of the women's role in the destruction of Jerusalem, which was introduced in verse 9, is now revisited. And this passage now places greater emphasis on the women than on the men. In verse 16 is a rejection itself. As for the word that thou hast spoken unto us in the name of Jehovah, we will not hearken unto you. They rejected all the words which Jeremiah spoke in the name of Jehovah. They acknowledge that Jeremiah has gotten his message from Jehovah, but as for this word from above, they say, we're not going to listen to you. We're going to do it my way, our way. So not only did they refuse to listen to the words of Jeremiah, but in verses 17 to 19, they went on to say that they would actively pursue the worship of the Queen of Heaven. First part of verse 17, they made a vow to worship the Queen of Heaven. But we will certainly perform every word that has gone forth out of our mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto her. So what we see here is that they vowed to perform every word which went out of their mouths. And their vow included two parts. First of all, to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven. And secondly, they also committed themselves to continuing to pour out drink offerings to her as well. Now, we did cover the Queen of Heaven earlier. A bit of a summary of what we said earlier here. The Queen of Heaven is the same as the Astarte of the Canaanites, the god Astarte or the goddess Astarte. It's the same as Ishtar of Babylon and Assyria. It's the same as the Asherah of the Hebrews when they fell into idolatry. It's the same as Aphrodite of the Greeks. It's also the same as Venus of the Romans. So if you're in the chaser, you can answer those questions. Yeah, or Jeopardy, you can answer those questions. Now, in all these cases, it is a goddess of sexual love, the goddess of maternity, and the goddess of fertility. And included in the worship of the Queen of Heaven, there was always cultic prostitution. The priestesses that were in charge were actually cultic religious prostitutes. And so by continuing to worship the Queen of Heaven, the Jewish refugees would be involved in cultic immorality. And then in the second part of verse 17, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. So in this verse here, those who practice it are going to be as they had done in the past, as their fathers, their kings, and their princes have done it. We're going to worship the Queen of Heaven. So this worship has been conducted in the places they mentioned in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. It had worked for them in the past, and therefore they thought it would work for them in the present. And the reason they vowed to continue worshiping the Queen of Heaven in the third part of verse 17, for them, because it says, "For then had we plenty of victuals and were well and saw no evil." So what we see here is that they had assumed that the past material blessings they had before the Babylonian destruction, they assumed that all those material blessings were because they worshiped the Queen of Heaven. They believed they received these material blessings from the Queen of Heaven and not from Jehovah. They said, when we worshiped the Queen of Heaven in the good old days, we had plenty of food. We were well physically. We saw no calamity. We did not see the type of calamity seen today. They also stated that their present sufferings in verse 18 were also due to their previous cessation of worshipping the Queen of Heaven. Verse 18 says, "But since we left off burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings onto her, we have wanted all things and have been consumed by the sword and by the famine." So they openly denied what Jeremiah said. In his message to the people through Jeremiah, Jehovah had declared that the people had brought their sufferings upon themselves. He had reiterated that he had punished them because of their disobedience to his word. But they said no. They said that their present sufferings were purely because they had stopped worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And the refugees rejected God's viewpoint and claimed that they would die in Egypt because they had stopped worshipping the Queen of Heaven on the orders of good old King Josiah back in 2 Kings 23, 6-9. 2 Kings 23, 6-9. When he came in, he had them destroy all those things. Now, their admission here in verse 18 tells us of the temporary success of Josiah's reforms. It was good King Josiah that ended the worship of the Queen of Heaven. However, after he was killed in the war against the Egyptians, the kings that followed Josiah returned to the worship of the Queen of Heaven. And these wives said that the troubles began when they stopped worshipping the Queen of Heaven in the days of Josiah. Actually, the trouble began after Josiah's death. The trouble began after they reinstituted the worship of the Queen of Heaven, or the pagan kings which worship the Queen of Heaven. Nevertheless, these women said that once they stopped worshipping the Queen of Heaven, they have wanted all things and they have been consumed by the sword and by the famine. They misconstrued their theology altogether and they formed a totally wrong theology. The wives drew the wrong conclusion theologically that it was all a result of the cessation of the worship of the Queen of Heaven. So their motivation to worship the Queen of Heaven, it may have actually stemmed from her reputation as being a goddess of fertility. Since childbearing was highly desired by women of that era, the worship of this goddess became widespread. For instance, some important Aramaic papyri were unearthed in a place called Elephantine, an island located on the Nile River in the country of Pathros, which is the area where the same region where some of the Jews, refugees from Mizpah had settled, which we saw back in 44 verse 1 and 44 verse 15. The papyri detail the lives of Jewish mercenaries and their families who lived in a fortified city on Elephantine between the 6th and 5th centuries BC. And several of these papyri contain references to Jehovah with an oath in the name of Anat Yahu being the most notable. Now, the first component of this name, which is Anat, refers to a female goddess. Second part, Yahu, is a Hebrew form of Jehovah's name. So apparently, according to this papyri, the Jews of Elephantine had developed their own form of idolatry by worshiping the Queen of Heaven as a female Jehovah and giving this goddess the feminine form of Jehovah's name, which is Anat Yahu. And when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings onto her, did we make her cakes to worship her and pour out drink offerings onto her without our husbands? So what we see in verse 19, we're told here that the practice of the wives was with the full knowledge and consent of the husbands. The wives were not to be blamed by themselves. While they appeared to be the instigators, they were not the only ones at fault. In fact, the men perhaps had a greater degree of guilt. Why? Because the men did not exercise true biblical headship and authority by causing their wives to cease. The practice of burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her and making cakes to worship her was supported by the husbands. So the worship of the Queen of Heaven was quite popular among the women in particular. The vows were made to her by Jewish wives. However, under the law of Moses, husbands could release their wives from foolish vows. That's the point of Numbers chapter 30, verses 6 to 16. Numbers 30, 6 to 16. Husbands had the full right to release their wives from any vows that they had made. So when the husbands heard that their wives were making these vows to the Queen of Heaven in verse 17, they had the full authority under the Mosaic law to annul these particular vows. But their failure to do so signified consent with their wives, what they were doing. And the husbands failed to exercise a spiritual authority. And their very failure gave the women a green light to continue on doing this. Now into the section where we see Jeremiah's final warning in verses 20 to 30 of chapter 44. So after the people now rejected his message, which is to stay in the land and remain there, Jeremiah now issued a final warning in verse 20 to 30. And we're going to look at it. The first section we're going to look at here is just the correct interpretation of history in verses 20 to 23. And then we see next session the judgment of the refugees in verses 24 to 30. In verses 20 to 23, Jeremiah now presented the correct version of history, addressing the very things that the women had misconstrued when they developed their own religion. Verse 20 lists the recipients of Jeremiah's message. Then Jeremiah said unto all the people, to the men and to the women, even to all the people that had given him that answer, saying, now, what was that answer? That answer was detailed back in verses 15 to 19 of what we just covered. And it was primarily given by the women. So in response to the people's rejection of his message, Jeremiah was making one final proclamation. And verse 21 spells out this proclamation. The incense that you burn in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, you and your fathers, your kings and your princes, and the people of the land, did not Jehovah remember them, and came it not into his mind? This is a rhetorical question here. The answer to this rhetorical question is certainly Jehovah does remember the idolatry of his people in the land. The idolatry was the burning of incense in cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. And those guilty were the present generation of Jews in Egypt, their fathers, the kings, the princes, and all the people of the land. The very ones mentioned earlier are now mentioned again as being guilty. Did not the Lord remember them? And the word remember here means to place on one's account. Did not God remember the sins of idolatry of these people and so place this sin upon their account? Did it not come into his mind? Both of these are rhetorical questions demanding yes answers. Yes, he did. It did come into his mind. And yes, he remembered the sins of the idolatry and he placed it upon their account. Yes, God did remember and it did come into his mind. And in verse 22, he now gives the result. First of all, so that Jehovah could not longer bear because of the evil of your doings and because of the abominations which you have committed. Word abominations is used in reference to the sin of idolatry. Second, therefore, certain results followed upon the land. First of all, we have, therefore is your land become a desolation and an astonishment. And second, it's become a curse. And third, the land became without inhabitant as it is this day. Then in the first part of verse 23, it says, because you have burned incense and because you have sinned against Jehovah and have not obeyed the voice of Jehovah, nor walked in his law, nor in his statutes, nor in his testimonies. So here he gives the reasons for it. First of all, they burned incense. They were guilty of idolatry. Second, they sinned against Jehovah. They disobeyed his laws and the law of Moses. And third, they have not obeyed his voice. They not only rejected the law of Moses, Mosaic law, but they also rejected the prophets. And so just as they rejected the message of Jeremiah in verses 15 to 19, they also rejected the message of the prophets, the rest of them. To re-emphasize their disobedience to the law of Moses, Jeremiah spells it out in 3 points. First of all, they did not walk in his law, that's Mosaic law. Second, they did not walk in his statutes. Third, they did not walk in his testimonies. And so the reason the calamity came upon them was not because they stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven. It wasn't that. The calamity came upon them because they failed to obey the law of Moses and the word of God to the prophets of Israel. That's why calamity came. And in the second part of verse 23, he spells out the correct theology. Therefore, this evil has happened unto you as it is this day. And the problem of the violation of the law of Moses and the problem of the disobedience to the prophets, because of this evil, or better, this calamity, is happened unto you as it is this day. So verses 20 to 23 was the true interpretation of history. It was not the way that the women saw it, but it was the way that God saw it. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.